Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. We all know the causes of climate change. I respect and appreciate hearing from the witnesses. Now we need to identify the practical ways to stop it, whether that's through regulation, deregulation, as in the example of hydropower, putting a price on carbon. I think that's probably useful. Carbon capture, R&D, or some combination. Some of these are more feasible than others, but let me be clear. Feasible is not a euphemism for a lack of ambition. It's just the opposite. Feasible means achievable. And I want to say from the bottom of my core is that we have to do this in a bipartisan way. What I've learned here is that if it's not bipartisan, it won't pass, and if it's not bipartisan, it won't last. And I really want to make sure that we get everyone on board. If it was up to me, we'd enact a national version of SB 100, which commits California to 100% carbon neutrality by 2045. It would take those steps. It's not up to me. It's not up to any single one of us to do that. So I'm looking forward to working with everyone on this committee to make progress. We know we've got to transition to a clean energy economy. There's not widespread agreement in either party what clean energy means. Maybe it's 100% renewables for some people, renewable electricity for other people, and whether renewable electricity is all zero and low carbon sources of renewables or net zero, we can talk about that, but there is a need to move. And I also just want to finally note the presence of Reverend Woodbury here, because there's a moral component to this too. And I'm aware of Pope Francis speaking out on this, as well as the Evangelical Environmental Network. Let me ask a couple questions of the witnesses. I'll start with Mr. Powell. Climate models show that we're going to need significant deployment of current and new clean energy technologies, including renewables, nuclear, carbon capture, and removal. While regulation is an important driver for technology deployment in the U.S. to help global emissions reductions, one of the most important things we can do is to lead on clean energy innovation. What's the federal government not doing right now that we should be doing to accelerate the deployment of these technologies?
Well, first, let me thank you, Representative Peters, for your leadership, especially in nuclear innovation and co-sponsoring the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, which we were pleased to see pass through Congress last year. That set a good precedent for creating a test bed in the federal government for developing and expanding these technologies. And so now I think the next step is, well, how can we go further, and how can we use other powers of the federal government to ramp these up more quickly? I think a good idea would be something like the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which takes the next step. It sets an aggressive goal to demonstrate multiple advanced reactor technologies within the next decade. It expands the power of the federal government to use its PPA authority to purchase some of the power from those reactors to get them set up and to get them financed. And it expands the availability of fuel that they would use. And I think we could take those kinds of approaches and apply it across all of the different clean energy technologies in order to scale them up more quickly.
Okay, I'm interested in talking to all of you about deployment as well on other technologies. Mr. Williams, I believe action on climate change is an opportunity to create economic growth, but it's undeniable that a shift away from fossil fuels will have an impact that's tough on certain sectors. I think we need to provide workers in those sectors with a path to jobs that just pay just as well or better, including retirement benefits and protections, the kind of jobs that can support families. In your testimony, you talked about specific things the committee can do in an infrastructure package. What do you see as the most important things for Congress to include in any climate legislation to protect workers?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Peters. We agree completely. That is a critical issue, and in my verbal testimony, I made sure to lean into the statement that we cannot let any workers or communities be left behind in this effort. There are a number of ways to do that, and among the best way is to direct the investments that would come from this to workers and communities that may be harmed, but just generally a commitment that we want to actually retain as many jobs as possible, first and foremost. And then, if that's unavoidable, make sure that there is that deep commitment, as you mentioned, to ensure that wages, benefits, healthcare, so on and so forth, people are taken care of throughout that process, and that there's significant economic development in communities that see that dislocation.
Great. We've seen, I think, a lot of progress in California that we can learn from as well on that front. Finally, I just want to say, with respect to Mr. Worthington, I don't have a chance to ask you a question, but we talk about all the people who are underserved in terms of energy around the world. It strikes me that the cell phone is a good thing to look at. You know, a lot of places without phones didn't build out whole set sort of telephone grids analogous to the energy grid, they did essentially microgrids through cell phones. And I would suggest that a large part of our foreign policy should be the deployment and promotion of microgrids, just like the United States Marine Corps has at Camp Pendleton near my district, that don't rely on a centralized fossil fuel-based source, but can rely heavily on renewables and on storage. And I think it's very feasible. We should certainly make that part of the mix. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.